Hello everyone, I am Mr. Bell. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Eddie Cortez had calculated fuel consumption down to the gallon during his 14 years of cross-country hauling. He knew exactly how many miles his Kenworth could travel on a full tank. But in December 2020, while hauling Christmas decorations from Los Angeles to Chicago, Eddie encountered a fuel situation that violated every law of physics he understood. Eddie was running behind schedule and had decided to push through the night. He was driving through the Mojave Desert on Interstate 40 when he realized he had made a serious miscalculation. According to his fuel gauge, he should have stopped for diesel in Barstow, but he had been distracted and forgotten to fill up. Now, at 2 a.m., in the middle of the desert, Eddie's fuel gauge was showing less than a quarter tank. He had maybe 50 miles of driving left before his truck would coast to a stop. The next truck stop was in Flagstaff, Arizona, still 180 miles away. Eddie grabbed his CB radio and called for help. Break 19. This is eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 47. I'm running low on fuel and need to know if there are any truck stops between here and Flagstaff. A voice crackled back through the static. Eastbound Ken, there's a fuel stop about 15 miles ahead on your right. Small place, easy to miss, but they've got diesel. Eddie felt relief. Thanks. What's the name of the place? No name on the sign, just says fuel in red letters. You'll see it. 15 miles later, Eddie spotted a small fuel station. It was exactly as described, a simple building with a single sign that said, Fuel, in faded red letters. The station looked like it had been built in the 1950s and hadn't been updated since. Eddie pulled up to the diesel pump and shut down his engine. The silence of the desert was profound. He climbed down and approached the fuel pump, expecting to find the usual credit card reader. Instead, he found an ancient mechanical pump with a handwritten sign that said, Pay inside first. The interior of the store was like stepping back in time. Behind the counter sat an elderly man who appeared to be at least 80 years old. Help you? The old man asked, in a voice that sounded like gravel. I need to fill up with diesel, Eddie replied. How much for a full tank? The old man studied Eddie with pale blue eyes. It depends on how far you're going, Chicago. I've got about 200 miles left to go. The old man nodded slowly. That'll be $50, cash only. Eddie was surprised by the low price. Diesel was running over $3 a gallon, and his tank held 200 gallons. $50 wouldn't even buy 20 gallons anywhere else. But he wasn't about to argue with a bargain. Eddie handed over $50 and walked back to his truck. He inserted the nozzle and squeezed the handle. The pump operated in complete silence, with no indication that fuel was being dispensed. The analog dial showed gallons being delivered, but Eddie couldn't hear or smell diesel. After what the pump indicated was a full tank, Eddie checked his fuel gauge. It showed completely full, even though the process had taken less than 2 minutes. He walked back to get his receipt, but found the building dark and empty. The open sign was off, and the door was locked. Confused but pressed for time, Eddie climbed back into his truck and continued east. The first strange thing Eddie noticed was that his fuel gauge didn't move. After 50 miles of driving, the needle remained exactly where it had been, completely full. Eddie knew he should have used at least 8 gallons by now, but the gauge showed no change. By the time Eddie reached Flagstaff, he had driven nearly 180 miles without using any measurable fuel. The gauge still showed full, and Eddie realized something impossible had happened at that desert fuel station. Eddie decided to test his theory. Instead of stopping for fuel in Flagstaff, he continued driving east. Through Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, and Illinois, Eddie's fuel gauge never moved from the full position. More than 200 miles later, Eddie arrived in Chicago with his fuel gauge still showing completely full. He had driven across half the continent without using a single gallon of diesel. Eddie completed his delivery and drove to a truck stop to inspect his fuel tank. When he looked inside with a flashlight, he could see diesel fuel at the normal full level. But when he tried to test it with a dipstick, the dipstick came out completely dry, as if there was no fuel in the tank at all. Eddie's truck continued to run on the mysterious fuel for 3 weeks. He He drove nearly 5,000 miles across multiple states, never stopping for diesel, never seeing his fuel gauge drop below full. But the fuel came with a price Eddie hadn't anticipated. He began experiencing vivid dreams about the desert fuel station, dreams where the elderly attendant would appear and explain that Eddie had made a deal he didn't understand. "That fuel will last as long as you keep driving," the old man would say in Eddie's dreams. "But if you ever stop trucking, if you ever park that rig for good, the fuel will disappear all at once. And when it goes, it'll take something with it." The old man would show him visions of other drivers who had received the mysterious fuel, drivers who had been forced to keep driving indefinitely. "There's a convoy of us out there," the old man explained. "Drivers who made the same deal you did. They've been driving for decades, never able to stop, never able to retire. The fuel keeps them going, but it also keeps them trapped." Eddie began to notice other trucks on the highways, older rigs driven by drivers who seemed to be in constant motion. These trucks would appear briefly in his mirrors, but they would vanish when Eddie tried to get a closer look. The realization hit Eddie 3 weeks after his encounter. He wasn't just getting free fuel. He was being recruited into some kind of supernatural trucking company, a fleet of drivers who had traded their freedom for an endless supply of diesel. Eddie made a decision that would change his life forever. He drove his truck to his company's yard, parked it permanently, and quit trucking. Within hours, his fuel gauge dropped to empty, and his engine sputtered to a stop. But as the old man had warned, the fuel didn't just disappear. It took something with it. Eddie found that he could no longer remember specific details about his trucking career, could no longer recall the faces of drivers he had known for years. The supernatural fuel had been sustaining more than just his truck. It had been preserving his identity as a trucker. When the fuel disappeared, it took with it years of memories and experiences that had defined who Eddie was. Eddie Cortez now works at a loading dock in Los Angeles, having lost most of his memories of life on the road. He sometimes has vague recollections of driving across the country, but the details are fuzzy. He knows he used to be a trucker, but he can't remember why he quit. The fuel that never runs out is still available to desperate drivers who find themselves stranded in the Mojave Desert. The mysterious station appears to those who need it most, offering a deal that seems too good to be true. And like all deals that seem too good to be true, the price is higher than anyone expects to pay. Bobby Chen had been an independent trucker for 11 years when he received the dispatch call that would trap him in an endless cycle of deliveries he could never complete. It was a foggy November morning in 2021 when Bobby's phone rang with what seemed like a routine job offer. "This is Eternal Logistics," said a woman's voice that sounded strangely distant. "We have a high-priority load from Portland to Seattle. Are you available?" Bobby was parked at a truck stop in Oregon looking for his next job. The timing was perfect and the rate was excellent, nearly double his usual earnings for such a short haul. "What's the cargo?" Bobby asked. "Medical supplies," the dispatcher replied. "Time-sensitive materials for a research facility. Pick up at 1247 Industrial Boulevard in Portland. You need to be there by 3 p.m. today." Bobby accepted the job and drove to the Portland address. He found a nondescript building with no company signs. The loading dock was empty except for a single trailer, already loaded and ready. A man in a gray uniform approached Bobby's truck. He had pale skin and eyes that seemed to look through Bobby rather than at him. "You're here for the Seattle delivery?" "That's right. Bobby Chen from Chen Transport." The man handed Bobby a clipboard. "Sign here. Do not open the trailer under any circumstances. Deliver to 892 Research Drive in Seattle." Bobby glanced at the paperwork. The manifest listed biological samples weighing 42,000 pounds. The trailer appeared to be a standard refrigerated unit, though it was running unusually quietly. Bobby hooked up the trailer and began driving north to Seattle on Interstate 5. After 2 hours of driving, Bobby should have been well into Washington state. Instead, the mile markers indicated he was still in Oregon, near where he had started. His GPS showed conflicting information, sometimes progress toward Seattle, other times driving in circles. Bobby pulled over and called Eternal Logistics. He explained, "My GPS shows inconsistent readings, and I don't seem to be making progress. Continue driving north on Interstate 5. The dispatcher replied in that same distant voice. "You are making progress. The delivery must be completed. But I've been driving for 2 hours and I'm still showing the same mile markers. Continue driving north on Interstate 5. The delivery must be completed." The line went dead. Bobby continued north, but the same pattern repeated. No matter how long he drove, the mile markers never changed. The landscape remained identical, and his fuel gauge stayed at exactly the same level. Bobby tried calling other companies, but every number connected him to the same woman at Eternal Logistics. Continue driving north on Interstate 5. The delivery must be completed. As night fell, Bobby realized he was trapped in an impossible loop. He had been driving for 8 hours, but made no measurable progress. His odometer showed over 400 miles traveled, but he was still passing the same landmarks. Bobby decided to investigate his cargo. Despite the warnings, he opened the trailer doors. Inside, the trailer was completely empty, except for a small metal box sitting in the center, some kind of electronic device. The device was humming softly and emitting a faint blue light. As Bobby approached, he heard voices coming from inside, dozens of different voices, all speaking at once. Continue driving north on Interstate 5. The delivery must be completed. Bobby realized the voices belonged to other truckers who had accepted deliveries from Eternal Logistics. They were all trapped in the same endless loop, driving forever toward destinations they could never reach. Bobby tried to destroy the device, but his hands passed right through it as if it was made of light. The voices grew louder, more insistent, calling his name and demanding he return to his truck. "You can't escape," one voice said clearly. "Once you accept a dispatch from Eternal Logistics, you drive until the end of time. We've been driving for years, some for decades. The road never ends." Bobby ran back to his truck and tried to unhook the trailer, but the coupling mechanism wouldn't release. It was permanently fused to his truck. He tried calling 911, but his phone only connected to Eternal Logistics. Continue driving north on Interstate 5. The delivery must be completed. Bobby had no choice but to continue driving. As hours passed, he began seeing other trucks on the highway, dozens of big rigs all traveling in the same direction, all carrying similar unmarked trailers. When Bobby tried to signal other drivers with his CB radio, he heard only the repeated message. Bobby realized he was now part of a phantom convoy of truckers trapped by Eternal Logistics. They drove through an endless night on a highway that led nowhere, carrying cargo that didn't exist, pursuing deliveries that could never be completed. Days blended into weeks as Bobby drove through the same highway section over and over. His truck never needed fuel, never broke down, never showed wear. He never got hungry or tired, sustained by whatever supernatural force kept him trapped. Bobby tried everything to escape. He attempted to drive off the highway, but invisible barriers prevented leaving the roadway. He tried stopping, but the engine would restart automatically. He tried abandoning his truck on foot, but found himself back in the driver's seat within minutes. Bobby learned that Eternal Logistics wasn't a real company. It was a supernatural entity that fed on the endless motion of trapped truckers. The dispatches were bait, designed to lure independent drivers looking for high-paying jobs who wouldn't ask too many questions. The entity derived power from keeping truckers in perpetual motion, forever chasing deliveries that existed only as psychological motivation for continued driving. The drivers became part of a supernatural engine, powering something beyond human understanding. Bobby Chen is still driving north on Interstate 5, trapped in an endless loop with dozens of other truckers who answered the wrong dispatch call. His truck passes the same mile markers day after day, carrying an empty trailer toward a destination that doesn't exist. Other truckers occasionally report seeing the phantom convoy, a line of trucks driving in perfect formation through fog-shrouded sections of I-5, their drivers staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. These sightings always occur at night, and the trucks vanish when approached. The dispatch that never ends is still recruiting new drivers. Independent truckers receive calls from Eternal Logistics offering high-paying jobs with simple requirements. The jobs seem too good to be true, and they are. But by the time drivers realize their mistake, they're already trapped in the endless convoy. Tom Bradley had driven Interstate 80 through Nevada hundreds of times during his 20-year career as a long-haul trucker. He knew every mile marker, every truck stop, and every rest area between Reno and Salt Lake City. That's why what happened in October 2017 shook him to his core and eventually forced him to retire from trucking altogether. Tom was hauling a load of furniture from California to Chicago, running behind schedule due to delays at the loading dock. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he found himself driving through the desolate stretch of I-80 between Winnemucca and Elko, Nevada. This particular section of highway was notorious among truckers for its isolation, 170 miles of mostly empty desert with few services and even fewer places to stop. Tom had been driving for 11 hours and was approaching his legal limit. His eyes were burning, and he could feel the dangerous pull of microsleep starting to affect his concentration. He needed to find a place to rest for at least 8 hours before continuing, but he knew there were no official rest areas in this section of highway. That's when he saw the sign. Rest area 2 miles appeared in his headlights, exactly like any other highway sign. Tom blinked hard, thinking fatigue might be causing him to hallucinate. But the sign was real and clearly visible. He had driven this route countless times and had never seen a rest area sign at this location. But Tom was too tired to question his good fortune. 2 miles later, Tom saw the entrance ramp to what appeared to be a standard highway rest area. Solar-powered lights illuminated a small parking area, with spaces for about a dozen cars and 4 or 5 trucks. There was a small brick building that looked like typical rest area facilities surrounded by desert landscaping and the usual informational signs about local wildlife and history. Tom pulled his rig into one of the truck parking spaces and shut down his engine. The sudden silence was profound. No highway noise, no other vehicles, just the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert. Tom grabbed his logbook to record his rest period and noticed something strange. According to his GPS, he was parked in the middle of empty desert. The device showed no rest area, no facilities, nothing but sagebrush and sand. GPS must be glitching, Tom muttered to himself, though he had never experienced problems with the unit before. He was too exhausted to worry about technical issues and decided to trust his eyes over the electronic device. Tom climbed into his sleeper berth and was asleep within minutes, but his rest was disturbed by strange dreams. He dreamed of other truckers who had stopped at this same rest area, drivers he seemed to recognize but couldn't quite place. In his dreams, these drivers were trying to tell him something important, but their voices were muffled and distorted, like they were speaking through water. Tom woke up after 6 hours feeling more tired than when he had gone to sleep. The dreams had been so vivid and disturbing that he felt like he hadn't rested at all. As he prepared to get back on the road, he decided to use the rest area facilities before continuing his journey. The brick building was unlocked, and the facilities inside appeared clean and well-maintained. But something felt wrong. The air inside was stale and cold, despite the desert heat outside. The fluorescent lights flickered irregularly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Most disturbing of all, there were no mirrors in the restroom, just empty frames where mirrors should have been. Tom used the facilities quickly and headed back to his truck, eager to get back on the highway. But as he walked across the parking area, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were other vehicles parked in spaces that had been empty when he arrived. An old sedan from the 1980s, a pickup truck that looked like it hadn't run in years, and another semi-truck with faded paint and rust stains. Tom walked over to the other semi-truck and peered through the driver's side window. What he saw made him stumble backward in shock. There was a driver in the cab, slumped over the steering wheel as if asleep. But something was wrong with the man's appearance. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his clothes looked decades out of date. Tom knocked on the truck's door, but the driver didn't respond. Tom knocked harder, shouting, "Hey, are you okay in there?" but got no reaction. The man appeared to be breathing, but his chest rose and fell in an unnaturally slow rhythm, like he was in some kind of deep hibernation. Panicking, Tom ran to the old sedan and looked through its windows. Another person sat behind the wheel, a woman in clothing that looked like it was from the 1970s. Like the truck driver, she appeared to be alive, but in some kind of suspended state, breathing slowly and showing no awareness of the world around her. Tom's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Were these people sick? Dead? In some kind of coma? He pulled out his cell phone to call for help, but discovered he had no signal despite being on a major interstate highway where coverage was usually reliable. Fighting down his panic, Tom decided he needed to get back on the road immediately. Whatever was happening at this rest area, he wanted no part of it. He climbed into his cab and started his engine. But when he tried to drive toward the exit ramp, his truck wouldn't move forward. The engine was running normally. The transmission was engaged, but the truck remained stationary, as if held in place by some invisible force. Tom tried everything he could think of, checking his brakes, shifting gears, even getting out to examine his wheels for obstructions. Everything appeared normal, but his truck simply would not move. He was trapped in a rest area that shouldn't exist, surrounded by people who seemed to be caught in some kind of supernatural sleep. As the hours passed, Tom noticed that the other vehicles never moved either. The drivers remained in their same positions, breathing slowly, unresponsive to any attempts at communication. The sun rose and set, but the mysterious drivers never stirred, never left their vehicles, never showed any sign of normal human activity. Tom tried to stay awake, afraid that if he fell asleep, he might end up like the other drivers, trapped in some kind of eternal rest that was more like death than sleep. But fatigue eventually overwhelmed him, and despite his fears, he found himself drifting off in his sleeper berth. Tom woke up to the sound of his CB radio crackling with static. A voice was speaking, but the words were distorted and unclear. As he listened more carefully, Tom realized the voice was calling his name. Tom Bradley, you need to leave now. Before it's too late, Tom grabbed his CB microphone. Who is this? Where are you? The voice became clearer, and Tom recognized it as belonging to another trucker he had known years earlier, a driver named Pete Kowalski, who had died in a truck accident in 2015. Tom, you're in danger. This place. It collects drivers who are too tired to continue. Once you fall asleep here, you become part of it. You have to leave now while you still can. Pete, is that really you? How is this possible? Don't ask questions you don't want the answers to. Just get in your truck and drive. Don't look back, don't stop. And whatever you do, don't fall asleep again until you're at least 50 miles away. Tom didn't need to be told twice. He climbed into his cab and tried his engine again. This time, the truck responded normally. Tom drove toward the exit ramp as fast as he dared, his heart pounding with terror and confusion. As he merged back onto Interstate 80, Tom looked in his mirrors one last time at the mysterious rest area. In the early morning light, it looked abandoned and run down, nothing like the well-maintained facility he had seen the night before. The other vehicles were still there, but they now appeared to be derelict wrecks that had been sitting in the desert for decades. Tom drove for the next 6 hours without stopping, sustained by pure adrenaline and terror. When he finally felt safe enough to pull over at a legitimate truck stop in Utah, he called his company dispatcher to report what had happened. Tom, I've got your GPS tracking data right here, the dispatcher said. According to our records, you were parked on the side of I-80 in the middle of the desert for about 10 hours. There's no rest area at that location, just empty highway. Tom tried to explain what he had experienced, but even as he spoke, the details seemed increasingly unreal. Had he hallucinated the entire incident? Was it possible that fatigue had caused him to pull over on the shoulder and dream the whole thing? But when Tom checked his truck's interior, he found evidence that his experience had been real. Desert sand on his boots from walking around the rest area, a strange, stale smell that had clung to his clothes. And most disturbing of all, his logbook showed that he had been stationary for exactly the amount of time he remembered spending at the rest area. Tom completed his delivery to Chicago, but he couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the Nevada desert. He researched the history of that stretch of I-80 and discovered something that chilled him to the bone. Over the past 30 years, dozens of truck drivers had been found dead in their cabs along that section of highway, apparently having died in their sleep from natural causes. Most disturbing of all, Tom found online forums where other truckers described encountering a mysterious rest area in the same location. Their stories were remarkably similar to his own: a well-maintained facility that appeared on no maps, other drivers who seemed to be sleeping but never woke up, and the terrifying realization that the place was some kind of trap for exhausted drivers. Tom never drove through Nevada again. He took early retirement within 6 months of the incident and moved to a small town in Oregon where he operates a local delivery service. He won't drive at night anymore, and he's never used a CB radio since hearing Pete Kowalski's warning from beyond the grave. The rest area is still there, according to the truckers who frequent the online forums. It appears to drivers who are dangerously tired, offering them what seems like salvation, but delivering something far more sinister. Some drivers report seeing the same vehicles Tom described with the same mysterious occupants who breathe slowly but never wake up. Tom knows that somewhere on Interstate 80 in Nevada, there's a rest area that exists in the space between exhaustion and death, collecting drivers who are too tired to continue their journey. The people trapped there aren't quite dead, but they're no longer truly alive either, caught in an eternal rest that serves as a warning to anyone foolish enough to push themselves beyond their limits on America's loneliest highways. The desert keeps its secrets, and some rest stops offer a kind of rest from which there is no awakening. Tom Bradley was lucky enough to escape, but he knows that other drivers haven't been so fortunate. Every time he hears about a trucker found dead in his cab from apparent natural causes, Tom wonders if that driver made the mistake of stopping at a rest area that doesn't officially exist. In the world of long-haul trucking, fatigue kills more drivers than accidents, weather, or mechanical failure. But sometimes, Tom knows, fatigue doesn't just kill. Sometimes it traps you in a place where death and sleep become indistinguishable, where the promise of rest becomes a prison from which escape is nearly impossible. Rick Jameson thought he had seen every type of trucker convoy during his 18 years on the road. He'd been part of organized protests, funeral processions, and charity runs that stretched for miles across America's highways. But in November 2019, while hauling a load of machinery from Detroit to Phoenix, Rick encountered a convoy that defied everything he understood about trucking, time, and reality itself. It started around 3 a.m. on Interstate 70 in Kansas, one of the loneliest stretches of highway in the American heartland. Rick was fighting to stay awake, sustained by truck stop coffee and the promise of a good payday at the end of his run. The highway was virtually empty except for the occasional passenger car and the distant glow of oncoming headlights. That's when Rick saw them in his mirrors, a line of trucks approaching from behind, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a procession of mechanical ghosts. At first, Rick assumed it was just a group of drivers who had coordinated their schedules to travel together for safety and companionship, a common practice among long-haul truckers. But as the convoy drew closer, Rick noticed something unusual. The trucks were old, much older than the modern rigs that dominated today's highways. Through his mirrors, Rick could make out the distinctive silhouettes of 1970s and 1980s big rigs, Peterbilts with long hoods, Kenworths with classic styling, and Freightliners that hadn't been manufactured in decades. The lead truck pulled alongside Rick's cab, and the driver inside gave him the traditional trucker wave. Rick waved back, but as he looked more closely at the other driver, he felt a chill run down his spine. The man behind the wheel was wearing clothing that looked decades out of date, a flannel shirt and trucker cap that belonged to an earlier era of highway culture. More disturbing was the driver's appearance. His face had a grayish pallor, and his eyes seemed to stare straight ahead without blinking. When Rick tried to make eye contact, the other driver showed no recognition or acknowledgement, just that same blank, forward-focused stare. The convoy consisted of 12 trucks, all vintage models that Rick recognized from his early days in trucking. They maintained perfect formation, exactly the same distance apart, traveling at precisely the same speed. Rick had never seen such disciplined convoy driving. Even professional military convoys weren't this perfectly synchronized. Rick grabbed his CB radio and tuned to Channel 19, expecting to hear the usual chatter that accompanied group drives. Instead, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a constant stream of radio traffic from the convoy. But the voices sounded distorted and distant, like they were coming from underwater or across vast distances of time. Breaker 19, this is eastbound Pete at mile marker 394. We've got a problem with the load securement. Copy that, Pete. Maintain formation. We'll check it at the next stop. When's the next stop, convoy leader? We've been running for 18 hours straight. There is no next stop. We keep rolling until we reach our destination. What destination? I can't remember where we're supposed to be going. Rick tried to break into their conversation. Hey there, convoy. This is the blue Freightliner running alongside you. What's your destination? The radio went silent for a moment, then erupted with overlapping voices, all speaking at once in that same distorted underwater tone. Who's that on the radio? There's someone else out here. He's not supposed to be here. Make him go away. Make him stop following us. Rick felt panic rising in his chest. He wasn't following them. They had caught up to him, and their radio chatter suggested they had been driving for far longer than federal regulations allowed. No driver was permitted to operate for 18 consecutive hours. Yet these truckers seemed to have no concept of rest periods or safety regulations. The lead truck began to slow down, and the entire convoy matched its speed perfectly. Rick maintained his pace, but soon found himself pulling ahead of the mysterious procession. As he looked in his mirrors, he could see all 12 trucks maintaining their formation, even as they fell behind. Rick tried his CB radio again. "Convoy, this is that blue Freightliner. You guys okay back there? You're falling behind." This time only one voice responded, the convoy leader, speaking with an authority that seemed to echo from decades past. "You need to get off this highway. This road belongs to us between midnight and dawn. We've been running this route for 47 years, and we don't need company." 47 years? Rick replied. "That's impossible. No one runs the same route for that long. We've been running this route since November 15, 1972. We're carrying a load that has to be delivered, and we won't stop until we reach our destination." Rick felt a wave of dread wash over him. November 15, 1972. He had heard that date before in trucking circles. It was the date of one of the worst trucking accidents in Kansas history. A convoy of 12 trucks had been caught in a sudden blizzard and had crashed in a chain reaction accident that killed all the drivers involved. Rick grabbed his phone and quickly searched for information about the 1972 accident. What he found confirmed his worst fears. On November 15, 1972, a convoy of 12 independent truckers had been traveling together on Interstate 70 through Kansas when they were caught in a sudden whiteout blizzard. The lead truck had lost control, causing a chain reaction crash that involved all 12 vehicles. No survivors were found. According to the news reports, the convoy had been carrying various cargo loads to different destinations across the Southwest. The drivers had banded together for safety during the dangerous weather conditions, but their caution had ultimately been their downfall. Rick looked in his mirrors again and saw that the convoy was gaining on him once more. The 12 trucks maintained their perfect formation, and now Rick could see more details that filled him with terror. The trucks showed signs of severe damage, crushed cabs, twisted trailers, and broken windshields that should have made them impossible to operate. Most horrifying of all, Rick could now see the drivers more clearly. They all shared that same grayish complexion and blank stare. Some appeared to have injuries that would be fatal to living people. One driver's head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Another had bloodstains on his shirt that looked fresh despite being nearly 50 years old. The convoy leader's voice crackled over the CB radio again. "You're interfering with our delivery schedule. We've been trying to complete this run for 47 years, and we can't afford any more delays." "What are you carrying?" Rick asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Christmas presents," came the reply. "Toys for children who have been waiting for us to arrive. We promised we'd deliver them on time, and a trucker's word is his bond." Rick felt tears forming in his eyes as he realized the full tragedy of what he was witnessing. These drivers had died trying to deliver Christmas presents to families across the Southwest. They had been carrying loads of toys and gifts when the blizzard struck, and their sense of duty was so strong that death itself couldn't stop them from trying to complete their deliveries. The convoy pulled alongside Rick once more, and this time he could hear voices calling out from the other trucks, not through the CB radio, but somehow carried on the wind itself. "Help us find our way. We've been lost for so long. The children are still waiting for their presents. We promised we'd get there by Christmas morning." Rick looked at his dashboard clock and realized it was November 15th, exactly 47 years after the fatal crash. The convoy only appeared on this date, still trying to complete the deliveries they had died attempting to make. "Where are you supposed to deliver the presents?" Rick asked over the CB. "Phoenix, Tucson, Albuquerque, Denver," came the response. 12 different cities, 12 different families. We've been driving in circles for decades, but we can never find the right exits. The highway keeps changing, and nothing looks the same as it did in 1972. Rick realized that the interstate system had been extensively modified since 1972 with new exits, route changes, and construction that would make navigation impossible for drivers from that era. The ghostly convoy had been trapped in an endless loop, trying to navigate a highway system that no longer matched their outdated maps and memories. "I can help you," Rick said, surprising himself with his offer. "I know the current routes to all those cities. I can guide you to your destinations." The convoy leader's voice carried a note of hope for the first time. "You'd do that for us? Help us complete our final run?" Rick thought about the families who had waited for Christmas presents that never arrived in 1972, about children who had grown up wondering why their gifts hadn't come. He thought about the drivers who had died with their duty unfulfilled, trapped in an eternal cycle of trying to complete their last delivery. "Follow me," Rick said. "I'll get you where you need to go." For the next 8 hours, Rick led the Phantom convoy across Kansas, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona. At each destination city, one of the trucks would peel off from the formation and disappear into the urban landscape, presumably to make a delivery that was nearly 50 years overdue. By dawn, only the convoy leader remained, following Rick toward Phoenix. As the sun rose over the Arizona desert, the last truck began to fade like morning mist. The convoy leader's voice came over the CB one final time. "Thank you, son. We can finally rest now. Our deliveries are complete." Rick watched in his mirrors as the final truck disappeared with the rising sun. He pulled over at the next rest area and sat in his cab, emotionally drained by what he had experienced. When he checked his CB radio, there was no record of the conversations he had heard during the night. Rick completed his own delivery to Phoenix and drove home to California. But he never forgot the night he helped a convoy of dead truckers complete their final run. Every November 15th since then, Rick has driven the same route through Kansas, hoping to encounter other lost drivers who might need guidance to their final destinations. The Highway Patrol in Kansas still receives occasional reports of a phantom convoy on Interstate 70, but the sightings have become increasingly rare. Most drivers assume Rick's intervention allowed the ghostly truckers to finally complete their deliveries and find peace. But Rick knows that somewhere out there, other convoys from other eras might still be running endless routes, carrying loads that were never delivered, driven by men and women whose sense of duty transcends death itself. The highways of America are haunted by the spirits of truckers who died with their work unfinished. And sometimes, if you're driving alone on a dark November night, you might see their headlights in your mirrors, asking for help to complete one last run. Rick Jameson continues to drive long-haul routes across the American Southwest, but he's never again encountered the convoy that never stops. He knows they're finally at rest, their Christmas deliveries completed nearly 50 years late. And somewhere, families who once wondered why their presents never arrived might have found mysterious packages on their doorsteps, gifts from drivers who refused to let death prevent them from keeping their promises. Carl Watson had rolled through thousands of way stations during his 22 years of long-haul trucking. He knew the routine by heart. Pull onto the scale, wait for the green light, get waved through or pulled aside for inspection. It was just another part of the job, as routine as checking mirrors or calculating fuel consumption. But in August 2018, while hauling electronics from Portland to Atlanta, Carl encountered a way station on Interstate 84 in Idaho that changed everything he thought he knew about the roads he traveled. Carl was making good time through the mountainous terrain of eastern Idaho when he saw the familiar blue sign, "All commercial vehicles must stop, way station 1 mile." He had driven this route dozens of times over the years, but he couldn't recall a way station at this particular location. Still, new facilities were built regularly, and Carl figured the Idaho Department of Transportation had constructed a new checkpoint since his last trip through the area. The way station appeared modern and well-maintained, with fresh asphalt, bright LED lighting, and electronic signs displaying current weight limits and regulations. A single-scale platform stretched across the roadway, flanked by a small building that housed the inspection office. Everything looked perfectly normal and official. Carl pulled his rig onto the scale and waited for the automated system to weigh his truck and trailer. The LED display showed his total weight as 78,640 pounds, well within legal limits for his axle configuration. He expected to see the green light that would allow him to continue, but instead, a red light flashed, and an electronic sign displayed a message. "Report to Scale House." Carl sighed and climbed down from his cab. Getting pulled for a random inspection was always a time-consuming hassle, but it was part of the business. He walked to the scale house, expecting to meet a DOT officer who would check his logbook and vehicle inspection records. The building's interior was sterile and overly bright, with fluorescent lights that seemed to buzz with an intensity that made Carl's eyes water. Behind a glass partition sat a man in what appeared to be a standard DOT uniform, though something about his appearance struck Carl as odd. The officer's skin had an unusual pallor, and his eyes seemed to focus on something beyond Carl rather than making direct eye contact. "Driver's license, medical card, and logbook," the officer said in a monotone voice that sounded like it was coming from a great distance. Carl handed over his documents and waited while the officer examined them with unusual thoroughness. The man's fingers moved across the pages of Carl's logbook with mechanical precision, as if he was reading something more than just driving hours and rest periods. "Your load weight is acceptable," the officer said finally. "But we need to check something else." "What else?" Carl asked. "My permits are all current, and I'm within hours of service regulations." The officer looked directly at Carl for the first time, and Carl felt a wave of unease wash over him. The man's eyes were completely black, with no visible iris or pupil, just dark pools that seemed to reflect the harsh fluorescent lighting. "We need to weigh your guilt," the officer said matter-of-factly. Carl stared at the man, convinced he had misheard. "I'm sorry." "What?" "Your guilt. The weight of your conscience. The burden you carry that's not listed on your manifest." Carl felt his heart rate increase. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm hauling electronics equipment. Everything's properly documented." The officer stood up and walked to a door marked "Secondary Inspection." "Follow me, Mr. Watson. This won't take long." Carl wanted to refuse, to demand to speak to a supervisor, but something in the officer's tone compelled obedience. He followed the man through the door into a room that shouldn't have been able to exist within the small building. The space was vast and dimly lit, with what appeared to be another scale platform in the center. "Step onto the scale," the officer instructed. "This is ridiculous," Carl protested. "You can't weigh a person's conscience. That's not how anything works. Step onto the scale, Mr. Watson, or we can discuss the accident from March 15th, 2003. Carl's blood turned to ice. March 15th, 2003 was a date he had tried to forget for 15 years. It was the night he had been driving through Wyoming in a snowstorm, fighting to stay awake after driving longer than he should have. He had dozed off for just a few seconds, but it was enough. His truck had drifted across the center line and sideswiped a car carrying a family of 4. The accident report had cleared Carl of wrongdoing. The roads were icy, visibility was poor, and the investigating officer had ruled it an unavoidable accident caused by weather conditions. But Carl knew the truth. He had fallen asleep at the wheel, and his moment of inattention had changed lives forever. "How do you know about that?" Carl whispered. "We know about everything, Mr. Watson. Every choice, every consequence, every moment of regret that weighs on your soul. Step onto the scale." Carl walked onto the platform with trembling legs. The scale was unlike any he had ever seen. Instead of displaying numbers, it showed images. Carl watched in horror as scenes from his life played out on the digital display. The moment of the accident, the family in the other car, the little girl who had been paralyzed from the waist down. "Sarah Mitchell," the officer said, reading from a clipboard that hadn't been there moments before. "Age 7 at the time of the accident. She's 22 now, still in a wheelchair. Her parents divorced 2 years after the accident. The medical bills bankrupted the family." Carl felt tears streaming down his face. "It was an accident. I didn't mean for it to happen." "But you knew you were too tired to drive safely. You chose to continue rather than stop for rest. That choice has weight, Mr. Watson, considerable weight." The scale display showed more images. Carl's life after the accident, his increased caution, his perfect safety record, the charitable donations he made anonymously to spinal cord research. But it also showed the nights he couldn't sleep, the guilt that aided him, the way he avoided Wyoming highways where the accident had occurred. "Current weight of guilt, 847 pounds, the officer announced. "This exceeds the legal limit for emotional cargo." "What does that mean?" Carl asked, though he dreaded the answer. It means you've been carrying an overweight load for 15 years, Mr. Watson. Every mile you've driven, every delivery you've made, you've been hauling more than what's on your manifest. That's a serious violation. Carl looked around the impossible room, trying to understand what was happening to him. What do you want from me? The officer consulted his clipboard again. You have two options. You can continue carrying this load indefinitely, adding to it with each mile and each year, until the weight crushes you completely, or you can unload it here. How do I unload guilt? By facing the person you wronged, by accepting responsibility for your choices, by carrying the consequences instead of hiding from them. The room around Carl began to change, morphing from the sterile way station into a hospital room. In the bed lay a young woman, Sarah Mitchell, now 22 years old, just as the officer had said. She was reading a book, her legs motionless, under the hospital blanket. She can't see you, the officer explained. But you can see her. This is what your moment of inattention created. This is the weight you've been carrying. Carl approached the bed slowly, looking at the young woman whose life he had changed forever. Sarah had grown into a beautiful, intelligent-looking person, despite her circumstances. On her bedside table, Carl could see photographs of her graduation from college, surrounded by friends and family who clearly loved her. She became a teacher, the officer said. Special education, she works with disabled children, helping them adapt to their limitations. The accident that destroyed her mobility gave her a purpose she might never have found otherwise. Carl watched as Sarah closed her book and maneuvered herself into her wheelchair with practiced efficiency. Despite her disability, she moved with confidence and grace, clearly someone who had learned to thrive despite her circumstances. She doesn't hate you, the officer continued. She doesn't even think about you anymore. The accident was 15 years ago. She's built a full life since then. The only person still carrying the weight of that night is you. Carl felt something shifting inside him, like a massive burden being lifted from his shoulders. For 15 years, he had imagined Sarah as a victim, frozen in time at age 7, her life ruined by his mistake. But she had grown up, adapted, found meaning and purpose despite her challenges. The weight of guilt can only be carried by those who choose to bear it, the officer said. You can set it down whenever you're ready. Carl closed his eyes and made a conscious decision to release the guilt he had been carrying. When he opened them again, he was standing on the weigh station scale, and the display showed a different reading. Load accepted. Proceed with caution. The officer behind the glass partition looked normal now. A regular DIOD employee with kind eyes and a professional demeanor. Everything checks out, Mr. Watson. You're good to go. Drive safely. Carl walked back to his truck in a daze, feeling lighter than he had in 15 years. As he pulled away from the weigh station, he looked in his mirrors to see the facility one last time, but there was nothing there, just empty highway and sagebrush stretching toward the horizon. Carl stopped at the next truck stop and searched online for information about weigh stations on Interstate 84 in Idaho. According to the DOT website, there was no weigh station at the location where he had stopped. The nearest facility was 60 miles further east, near the Utah border. But Carl knew what he had experienced was real. He had been carrying an overweight load of guilt for 15 years. And somehow, somewhere on the highways of Idaho, there was a weigh station that could measure things that couldn't be quantified on any normal scale. Carl completed his delivery to Atlanta and began the long drive home to Oregon. For the first time in 15 years, he took the route through Wyoming, driving past the site of the accident without the crushing weight of guilt that had haunted him for so long. At a truck stop in Wyoming, Carl made a phone call he had been avoiding for 15 years. He contacted a private investigator and asked him to find current contact information for Sarah Mitchell. When he received the information 2 days later, Carl sent a letter not asking for forgiveness, but expressing his regret and explaining how her strength and resilience had inspired him to become a better person. Sarah's response arrived 3 weeks later. She thanked Carl for his letter and explained that she had forgiven him long ago. She invited him to visit her classroom if he was ever in her area so he could see the positive impact she was making in the lives of disabled children. Carl never found the mysterious weigh station again, despite driving that route dozens of times over the following years. But he knows it's out there somewhere, helping other drivers unload the invisible cargo that can weigh more than any physical freight they carry. The highways of America are full of weigh stations that measure tons and axle loads. But somewhere in Idaho, there's a facility that weighs the burden of conscience, the load of regret, and the freight of guilt that some drivers carry for years without realizing how much it's slowing them down. Carl Watson continues to drive long-haul routes across the western United States, but now he travels with a lighter load. He learned that some cargo is meant to be delivered, while other loads are meant to be set down and left behind. The weigh station that weighs more than cargo taught him the difference, and for that lesson, Carl will be grateful for the rest of his life. Marcus Reed had hauled everything imaginable during his 16 years as an independent trucker. Furniture, electronics, machinery, even livestock. But he had one rule he never broke. He didn't ask questions about sealed containers. The shipping manifest told him what he needed to know: weight, destination, delivery instructions. Everything else was someone else's business. That policy served him well until September 2021, when Marcus accepted a high-paying job that would make him question everything he thought he knew about the cargo he carried. The job came through a broker Marcus had never worked with before, a company called Meridian Logistics that offered twice his usual rate to haul a single container from a warehouse in Newark, New Jersey, to a research facility outside Las Vegas. The only catch was that the run had to be completed within 72 hours, and the container could never be left unattended during transport. Never unattended, Marcus had asked during the phone call with the dispatcher, "What about mandatory rest breaks? I can't legally drive more than 11 hours at a stretch." "You can rest," the dispatcher explained, "but you have to stay with the truck. No truck stops, no motels. If you need to sleep, you sleep in your cab. The container cannot be out of your direct supervision at any time." The pay was too good to pass up. Marcus needed the money to cover some unexpected medical bills, and the job seemed straightforward enough. He drove to the Newark warehouse on a Wednesday morning, expecting to pick up another routine load. The warehouse was located in an industrial district that looked like it hadn't seen maintenance in decades. Broken windows, rusted fencing, and weeds growing through cracked pavement gave the area a post-apocalyptic appearance. Pulled his truck up to loading dock 7 as instructed, and waited for the warehouse crew to bring out his cargo. What emerged from the building was unlike any container Marcus had ever seen. It was the right size and shape for standard shipping. But instead of the usual aluminum or steel construction, this container appeared to be made from some kind of dark matte material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There were no company logos, shipping labels, or identification markings of any kind. Most unsettling of all, the container was completely silent, despite being moved by a forklift. Usually, cargo would shift and rattle during loading. But this container made no sound whatsoever, as if it contained nothing at all or something so perfectly secured that it couldn't move. "What's in there?" Marcus asked the forklift operator, a thin man who seemed nervous and avoided eye contact. "Above my pay grade," the man replied. "I just load what they tell me to load." Marcus secured the container to his trailer with extra care, double-checking his chains and straps. According to the shipping manifest, the cargo weighed 34,000 pounds. Substantial but not unusual. However, as Marcus pulled away from the warehouse, he noticed that his truck didn't handle the way he expected for that weight. The container seemed to have its own center of gravity that didn't match its supposed mass. The first sign that something was wrong came about 50 miles outside Newark. Was driving through rural Pennsylvania when he noticed that his fuel consumption was much higher than normal. He was burning diesel at nearly twice his usual rate, as if the container was somehow making his engine work harder than the weight alone would justify. Marcus pulled into a rest area to check his fuel calculations and inspect his rig for mechanical problems. As he walked around his truck, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The container was covered with a thin layer of frost, despite the warm September weather. Ice crystals had formed along the edges of the container, and Marcus could see his breath fogging in the air near the trailer. More disturbing was the complete absence of sound from inside the container. Marcus had hauled refrigerated loads before, and reefer units made noise, compressors running, fans cycling, coolant pumping through lines. This container was maintaining freezing temperatures in complete silence, suggesting technology far beyond anything Marcus had encountered in commercial shipping. Marcus climbed back into his cab and called the dispatcher at Meridian Logistics. "I need to know what I'm hauling," he said. "This container is behaving in ways that don't make sense for normal cargo." "Everything is operating as expected." The dispatcher replied in a tone that suggested the conversation was over. "Continue to your destination. Do not deviate from your route, and do not leave the container unattended." "But what if there's a mechanical problem? What if I need repairs?" "There will be no mechanical problems. Just drive, Mr. Reed." The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with his questions and growing unease. He had no choice but to continue. He had already accepted the job and signed the contract. But as he pulled back onto the highway, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that he was carrying something that wasn't meant for the world of commercial trucking. The second disturbing incident occurred that evening as Marcus was driving through Ohio. He had been on the road for 8 hours and was approaching his mandatory rest break when he started hearing sounds from inside the container. Not the usual creaking and settling of cargo, but something that sounded almost like breathing. Slow, rhythmic inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from multiple sources. Marcus pulled over at a truck stop, but remembering his instructions, he parked away from other vehicles and remained in his cab. The breathing sounds continued, sometimes synchronized, sometimes overlapping like a chorus of sleepers. Marcus tried to convince himself that it was just the container expanding and contracting with temperature changes, but the rhythm was too organic, too deliberate. Around midnight, the sounds changed. Instead of breathing, Marcus began to hear what sounded like whispered conversations, multiple voices speaking in low tones that he couldn't quite understand. The words seemed to be in English, but they were spoken so softly and with such strange inflections that Marcus couldn't make out their meaning. Marcus grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19, hoping to hear normal trucker chatter that would help him feel less isolated. Instead, he heard something that chilled him to the bone. The same whispered voices that were coming from his container were now coming through his radio. "He's listening," one voice said clearly through the static. "He knows we're here," replied another. "Should we show him what he's carrying?" "Not yet. We need to reach our destination first." Marcus switched off his CB radio and sat in his darkened cab, trying to control his panic. The voices in the container continued their incomprehensible conversations, occasionally punctuated by what sounded like movement. Not the shifting of objects, but the deliberate repositioning of something that was alive and aware. Marcus tried to sleep, but every time he closed his eyes, the whispers would grow louder, as if the voices were responding to his level of consciousness. When he was awake and alert, the sounds remained at the edge of hearing. But the moment he began to drift off, the voices would become clear and insistent, discussing him as if he were part of their cargo manifest. "He's strong enough to complete the journey," one voice observed. "But will he stay silent about what he's carrying?" asked another. "He will. They always do. The fear ensures their cooperation." Marcus spent the rest of the night wide awake, staring at his dashboard clock and counting the hours until dawn. When morning came, he started his engine and continued west, desperate to complete this delivery and never think about it again. The third day of the journey brought new horrors. As Marcus drove through the deserts of Nevada, approaching his destination, the container began to affect his truck in ways that defied physics. His speedometer would fluctuate wildly, even when his actual speed remained constant. His GPS would show his location jumping erratically, placing him in impossible positions miles from any road. Most disturbing of all, Marcus began to see things in his mirrors that weren't there when he looked directly behind him. Other trucks following him at a distance, their drivers wearing clothing that looked decades out of date. Cars that appeared to be from different eras, all maintaining perfect formation behind his trailer, as if they were part of some invisible convoy. When Marcus would adjust his mirrors or turn around to look directly, the following vehicles would vanish. But they would reappear in his peripheral vision moments later, always maintaining the same relative positions, always driven by people whose faces he could never quite see clearly. The voices from the container grew more active as they approached Las Vegas, discussing their anticipated arrival with what sounded like excitement and anticipation. Marcus caught fragments of conversation that suggested his cargo wasn't just unusual, it was dangerous. "After so long in storage, we'll finally have new hosts to work with. The research facility has excellent security. No one will interfere with our integration process. The truck driver has served his purpose. He won't remember any of this once we're unloaded. Marcus realized that whatever he was carrying wasn't just cargo. It was something that intended to take control of the people at the research facility. And worse, it planned to erase his memory of the entire experience, leaving him with no way to warn anyone about what he had delivered. As Marcus approached the delivery address, a nondescript building surrounded by high fences and security cameras, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of completing the delivery, he drove past the facility and continued into the Nevada desert. The voices in the container immediately became agitated, speaking rapidly in overlapping conversations that Marcus could now understand perfectly. He's not stopping. Why isn't he stopping? Something's wrong. He's supposed to deliver us to the facility. We need to take control of him directly. Marcus felt something probing at the edges of his mind. Not quite thoughts, but a presence that was trying to influence his decisions. He fought against the mental intrusion, focusing on memories of his family, his home, anything that belonged to him alone. He's resisting us. How is that possible? Some humans are naturally immune to our influence. We should have tested him before selecting him as our carrier. It doesn't matter. We can force him to comply. The mental pressure increased, and Marcus could feel his willpower being overwhelmed by something alien and hostile. His hands began to turn the steering wheel without his conscious direction, guiding the truck back toward the research facility. But Marcus had one advantage the voices hadn't anticipated: his knowledge of trucking regulations. Instead of fighting the mental control directly, he triggered his truck's emergency brake system, bringing the rig to a sudden stop in the middle of the desert highway. The emergency stop caused the container to shift violently on the trailer. And for the first time since Noor, Marcus heard sounds of impact from inside. Not the movement of cargo, but what sounded like bodies falling and colliding with the container walls. The voices became shrieks of pain and fury, no longer attempting to sound human. Marcus could hear scratching and pounding from inside the container, as if whatever was trapped inside was trying to claw its way out. Marcus unhooked his trailer and drove away, leaving the container sitting alone in the Nevada desert. In his mirrors, he could see the container rocking back and forth with increasing violence, as if the contents were trying to break free through sheer force. Marcus drove straight to the nearest police station and tried to report what had happened, but found that he couldn't remember crucial details about the delivery. The mental contact with the voices had left gaps in his memory, making his story sound like the ravings of an exhausted, delusional trucker. The police investigated his claims, but found no evidence of the abandoned container. When they drove to the location Marcus described, they found only empty desert, no trailer, no cargo, no sign that anything had ever been there. Marcus never found out what happened to the container or its contents. Meridian Logistics had no record of employing him, and the Newark warehouse appeared to have been abandoned for years when investigators checked it. All evidence of the job had vanished, as completely as the container itself. But Marcus knows the delivery was real because of what followed him home. Strange whispers in empty rooms, shadows that move independently of their sources, and the constant feeling that something is watching him from just outside his field of vision. Whatever was in that container had left part of itself behind, attached to Marcus like a psychic parasite that feeds on his memories and slowly erases evidence of their encounter. Marcus knows that eventually he'll forget the entire experience, but the presence will remain, growing stronger as his memories fade. Marcus stopped long-haul trucking within 6 months of the Nevada incident. He now works local delivery routes that keep him close to home, but he knows distance won't protect him from what followed him back from the desert. Some cargo doesn't stay delivered. It finds new hosts, new carriers, new ways to spread itself across the highways of America. The load that follows you home is the most dangerous cargo a trucker can carry, because once you've transported it, you become part of its manifest forever. Marcus Reed learned that lesson in the Nevada desert, and now he's teaching it to others, one whispered conversation at a time. Roy Hutchins had been adjusting truck mirrors for 19 years, but he had never seen anything like what appeared in his driver's side mirror on a foggy October night in 2019. Roy was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Omaha to Little Rock, running through Missouri on Interstate 44, when his mirror began showing him things that hadn't happened yet, and some things he desperately hoped never would. The trouble started around 2 a.m. near Springfield, Missouri. Roy was fighting through a thick fog bank that had reduced visibility to less than 50 feet. He was running slowly and carefully, using his mirrors to monitor the few vehicles brave enough to travel in such conditions. That's when he noticed something impossible in his left mirror. Clear, bright daylight, where there should have been nothing but fog and darkness. Roy blinked hard and looked again, thinking fatigue might be playing tricks on his vision. But the image remained. His mirror was showing a sunny afternoon scene with clear blue skies and dry pavement. He could see other trucks and cars traveling at normal speeds, no fog anywhere in sight. Meanwhile, his windshield showed the reality of thick fog and near-zero visibility. "What the hell?" Roy muttered, adjusting his mirror to see if the angle was causing some kind of optical illusion. But no matter how he positioned it, the mirror continued to show bright daylight, while everything else around him remained shrouded in darkness and fog. Roy grabbed his CB radio and called out to other drivers. "Break 19. This is northbound Peterbilt at mile marker 78. Anyone else seeing weird stuff in their mirrors tonight?" A voice crackled back immediately. "Negative, Pete. Just fog thick as soup out here. What kind of weird stuff you talking about?" Roy hesitated, knowing how crazy his answer would sound. "Never mind. Must be tired. Y'all drive safe." But Roy wasn't tired, and he knew what he was seeing was real, even if it didn't make sense. His left mirror was displaying a different time of day, or possibly a different day entirely. As he continued driving through the fog, the mirror showed him the same stretch of highway under completely different conditions. The first prediction came 20 minutes later. In his mirror, Roy saw a red pickup truck passing him on the left, traveling at high speed despite the dangerous conditions. The truck appeared to lose control and slide sideways across both lanes before disappearing into the ditch. Roy watched the entire accident play out in his mirror while seeing nothing but empty fog ahead of him. 5 minutes later, Roy's headlights picked up a red pickup truck approaching from behind, traveling much too fast for the conditions. Roy grabbed his CB mic. "Southbound red pickup coming up fast. You need to slow down immediately. These roads are dangerous. Mind your own business, trucker," came the hostile reply. Roy watched helplessly as the pickup truck pulled alongside his cab, exactly as he had seen in his mirror. The driver was young, maybe early 20s, clearly trying to show off or prove something by driving recklessly in the fog. Just as the mirror had predicted, the truck began to slide sideways across both lanes. "Look out!" Roy shouted into his CB, but it was too late. The pickup truck spun out of control and crashed into the median, exactly as Roy had witnessed 5 minutes earlier in his mirror. Roy stopped his truck and ran back to help, finding the young driver shaken but alive. The man had a broken arm and possible concussion, but he would survive. As Roy waited with him for paramedics to arrive, he kept glancing at his truck mirror, wondering what other futures it might be showing him. The second prediction was even more disturbing. As Roy continued his journey south, his mirror began showing him an image of his own truck involved in a horrific accident. He could see his rig jackknifed across the highway, emergency vehicles with flashing lights, and what appeared to be a body covered with a white sheet being loaded into an ambulance. The scene in the mirror was so detailed that Roy could make out the mile marker, 156, still about 40 miles ahead of his current position. The timestamp on a visible digital billboard showed 4:23 a.m., approximately 2 hours in his future. Roy felt panic rising in his chest as he realized the mirror was showing him his own death. According to the vision, he would die in a truck accident at mile marker 156 at exactly 4:23 a.m. The fog in his mirror had lifted, but the accident scene suggested he had lost control during clear conditions, which didn't make sense. Roy immediately called his dispatcher to report a potential problem with his truck. "Jim, I need to pull over and do a complete vehicle inspection. Something doesn't feel right with the handling." "You're behind schedule already," the dispatcher replied. "Can't it wait until your next mandatory break?" "No, it can't wait. I've got a feeling something bad is going to happen if I don't check this truck over completely." Roy found a truck stop and spent the next hour going over every inch of his rig. He checked tire pressure, brake lines, steering components, and trailer connections. Everything appeared to be in perfect working order, but Roy couldn't shake the image of his own accident scene from the mirror. When Roy climbed back into his cab, the mirror was showing normal reflections again, just the truck stop parking lot and other vehicles. But as soon as he returned to the highway, the prophetic images resumed. This time, the mirror showed him a different accident at a different location, mile marker 134 at 3:45 a.m. Roy realized that by stopping for the inspection, he had changed his timeline and avoided the original accident. But the mirror was now showing him a new future, one where he would crash at an earlier mile marker. It seemed that his death was inevitable. Just the details were shifting based on his actions. Desperate to understand what was happening, Roy pulled over again and called the truck stop he had just left. "This is going to sound crazy," he told the mechanic who answered, "but has anyone ever reported problems with their mirrors showing things that haven't happened yet?" The mechanic was quiet for a long moment. "You seeing things in your driver's side mirror?" "Yeah." "How did you know which mirror?" "Because you're not the first driver to call about this. There's something wrong with that stretch of I-44 through Missouri. Drivers have been reporting strange mirror visions for about 6 months now. Most of them see accidents before they happen. Have any of the accidents actually occurred? That's the thing. None of them have. Every driver who's called about the mirror visions has managed to avoid whatever they saw. It's like the mirror is showing them what would happen if they didn't change course." Roy felt a mixture of relief and confusion. "So I'm not going crazy? Probably not. But you should take whatever you're seeing seriously." The drivers who ignored the warnings. Well, let's just say some of them didn't make it to their destinations. Roy thanked the mechanic and got back on the road. But this time he was prepared. Every time his mirror showed him an accident or dangerous situation, he would alter his route, speed, or timing to avoid it. The mirror seemed to be operating as some kind of early warning system, showing him potential futures that he could prevent through careful action. The most disturbing vision came as Roy approached Arkansas. His mirror showed him arriving at his delivery destination, a farm equipment dealership in Little Rock. But instead of a normal delivery, the scene was one of chaos and violence. Roy could see police cars, ambulances, and what appeared to be a hostage situation in progress. According to the mirror's vision, Roy would arrive at 10:30 a.m. and inadvertently drive into the middle of an armed robbery. The criminals would use his truck as cover, leading to a standoff that would result in multiple casualties, including Roy himself. Roy immediately called the dealership to warn them, but his call went straight to voicemail. He tried the local police but couldn't convince them to take seriously a report of a crime that hadn't happened yet, based on visions in a truck mirror. Instead, Roy decided to delay his arrival. He stopped for an extended rest break, then took a circuitous route through Little Rock that would bring him to the dealership from a different direction. When he finally arrived at 1:15 p.m., 3 hours later than the mirror had predicted, he found police cars surrounding the building. "What happened here?" Roy asked one of the officers. "Armed robbery this morning around 10:30, the officer replied. 3 guys hit the place when they opened. We caught them a few hours ago, but it was touch and go for a while." Roy felt his blood run cold. The robbery had happened exactly as his mirror had predicted, at the exact time he would have arrived if he had maintained his original schedule. By delaying his arrival, he had avoided becoming part of the crime scene. "Anyone hurt?" Roy asked. "One employee winged in the shoulder, but he'll be fine. Could have been much worse if things had escalated." Roy completed his delivery without mentioning the mirror visions, but he couldn't stop thinking about the implications. Was his mirror showing him a predetermined future, or was it showing him potential futures that could be changed? And why was he seeing these visions in the first place? On the return trip to Omaha, Roy's mirror showed him one final vision that answered some of his questions. He saw himself driving the same route 6 months earlier, but in this vision, he wasn't alone in his cab. There was a passenger, an elderly man in trucker clothing, who appeared to be giving Roy directions and warnings about road conditions ahead. Roy recognized the man as Charlie Morrison, a veteran driver who had died in an accident on I-44 near Springfield 6 months earlier. Charlie had been a mentor to younger drivers, always willing to share his knowledge about safe driving and hazard recognition. The vision in the mirror suggested that Charlie's spirit was somehow connected to this stretch of highway, using Roy's mirror to continue his mission of protecting other drivers. The accident predictions weren't random supernatural events. They were Charlie's way of passing along warnings to drivers who needed them. Roy never saw the prophetic visions again after that trip, but he heard from other drivers who had similar experiences on I-44 through Missouri. The phenomenon seemed to affect different drivers at different times, always showing them accidents and dangers they could prevent if they paid attention to the warnings. Roy changed his route to avoid that stretch of highway whenever possible, not because he was afraid of the visions, but because he felt he had already received the message Charlie Morrison was trying to send. Some highways are haunted by the spirits of drivers who died trying to help others, and sometimes those spirits find ways to continue their mission from beyond the grave. The mirror that shows tomorrow is still out there, reflecting in the vehicles of drivers who travel the dangerous curves and fog-prone sections of Interstate 44. Charlie Morrison is still protecting truckers, one vision at a time, proving that some guardians never retire from their watch over America's highways. Roy Hutchins continues to drive long-haul routes across the Midwest, but he pays closer attention to his mirrors now, knowing that sometimes they show more than just what's behind you. He learned that the future isn't fixed. It's a series of possibilities that can be changed by drivers who are brave enough to trust what they see and wise enough to act on the warnings they receive. In the world of long-haul trucking, where split-second decisions can mean the difference between life and death, having a guardian angel watching over you through your mirrors might be the most valuable safety equipment a driver can have. Frank Morrison had driven every major highway in the United States during his 23 years behind the wheel, but he had never encountered a road that led backward through time. That changed on a snowy January night in 2022 while hauling medical supplies from Boston to Denver when Frank took what appeared to be a normal detour. The trouble began near Syracuse, New York, where a major accident had closed Interstate 90. State police were directing traffic onto a detour route that Frank had never seen before. The detour sign pointed to State Route 17B, a designation that didn't match any road on his GPS. Frank followed the redirected traffic onto a two-lane highway that curved through heavily wooded terrain. The road was well maintained with clear yellow lines. But Frank noticed the complete absence of modern infrastructure. No cell towers, no power lines, no billboards. Just dense forest on both sides. His CB radio produced only static. His GPS showed his location as a blank area with no roads indicated. According to the satellite navigation, he was driving through uninhabited wilderness. After 30 minutes of driving, Frank began to notice disturbing changes. The trees looked older and more densely packed. The snow that had been falling heavily was becoming lighter, and his temperature gauge showed rising numbers. Frank checked his dashboard clock, 11:47 p.m., on January 15, 2022. But outside his windshield, the snow was disappearing, replaced by what looked like a warm summer evening. Stars were visible through clear skies, and Frank could see fireflies blinking in meadows. Frank pulled over and climbed out. The air was warm and humid, filled with cricket sounds and the smell of honeysuckle. When he looked back down the road, he could see snow falling in the distance, as if he had driven through some atmospheric boundary. The first real shock came when Frank crested a hill and saw a small town in the valley below. The community looked like something from the 1950s. Neon signs advertising motels and diners, classic cars parked along tree-lined streets, and architecture from an earlier era. Frank drove slowly through the town, noting vintage cars from the 1940s and 1950s. Gas station prices showed fuel at 23 cents per gallon. Movie theaters were advertising films that Frank recognized as classics from decades past. The people were dressed in mid-20th century clothing styles and moved with an unhurried pace. Some waved at Frank's truck as he passed, as if seeing a modern big rig in their 1950s town was perfectly normal. Frank stopped at a diner advertising best coffee in the county, 5 cents. The interior had red vinyl booths, a jukebox playing old songs, and waitresses in period uniforms. "What can I get you, hon?" asked a waitress named Betty. "Just coffee, please," Frank replied. "You're not from around here, are you?" Don't see many big trucks like yours on our roads. I'm hauling from Boston to Denver, Frank said carefully. I took a detour because of an accident on the interstate. Interstate? Betty looked confused. What's an interstate? Frank felt a chill. If this was really the 1950s, the term might not be familiar to small-town people. The main highway, Frank corrected. There was an accident on the main highway. Betty nodded. Good thing you found the old state road. Frank paid with a $5 bill and received change, including coins he hadn't seen in decades. The cash register was a manual model, requiring a handle pull to record the sale. As Frank continued driving, he encountered more evidence of time travel. Radio stations played era music with broadcasting styles from decades past. At a truck stop, he found chrome-covered big rigs from the 1950s and 1960s. Frank approached another trucker wearing suspenders and a vintage cap. "What year is this?" Frank asked. The driver looked at him strangely. 1957, of course. Why? What's the date? July 23, 1957. You feeling all right, partner? Frank realized he had traveled from winter 2022 to summer 1957. The road existed outside normal time, connecting different eras. Over several hours, Frank drove through landscapes, shifting through different decades, 1940s, 1930s, then earlier eras. The architecture became progressively older, cars fewer and more primitive. Frank began to worry that he was trapped in some kind of temporal loop, destined to drive backward through history until he reached a time before roads existed. But just as his fuel gauge was approaching empty, Frank saw a road sign that offered hope. Interstate 80, 5 miles. Frank followed the signs and found himself climbing a long hill through increasingly modern-looking terrain. The vintage cars disappeared, replaced by contemporary vehicles. Cell towers and power lines reappeared. By the time Frank reached the crest of the hill, he was back in the 21st century. Frank's GPS suddenly came back online, showing his location near Scranton, Pennsylvania. According to the system, he had somehow traveled nearly 200 miles south of where he had entered the mysterious detour, and his dashboard clock showed that 12 hours had passed, though Frank felt like he had been driving for only 3 or 4 hours. Frank tried to retrace his route to find the entrance to the temporal highway, but it was no longer there. The detour signs that had directed him onto State Route 17B had vanished, and there was no evidence that the road had ever existed. Frank completed his delivery to Denver and began researching his experience. He found scattered reports from other truckers who described similar encounters with roads that led through different time periods, always in areas where major highway construction had disturbed old transportation routes. Frank never encountered the road to yesterday again, despite deliberately seeking detours in areas where other drivers had reported similar experiences. But he kept the 1957 coins he had received as change at the diner, and he still has the local map that Betty had given him, physical evidence that his journey through time had been real. The road that leads back to yesterday is still out there, according to reports from drivers who have stumbled onto temporal detours during routine highway emergencies. These roads offer glimpses into America's past, showing travelers what life was like in simpler times, when the pace was slower and the world seemed less complicated. Mike Henderson had been driving 18-wheelers for over 15 years when he encountered something that made him question everything he thought he knew about the roads he traveled. It was March 2019, and Mike was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Chicago along Interstate 40. What started as a routine cross-country haul would become the most terrifying experience of his life. The first sign that something was wrong came around 2 a.m. near Flagstaff, Arizona. Mike was cruising through a particularly desolate stretch of highway when he noticed headlights in his mirrors that seemed to be following him at an unusual distance. The vehicle stayed exactly 3 car lengths behind, never getting closer, never falling back, even when Mike adjusted his speed. At first, Mike didn't think much of it. Maybe another trucker was using him as a pace car, or someone was just maintaining a steady speed on cruise control. But as the miles rolled by, the behavior became increasingly strange. When Mike slowed down for construction zones, the lights slowed down. When he sped up on clear stretches, they sped up. When he changed lanes, they changed lanes moments later. After about 40 miles of this synchronized driving, Mike decided to test his theory. He pulled into a rest stop near Winona, Arizona, expecting the vehicle to either pass by or pull in as well. Instead, the headlights simply disappeared. Mike sat in his cab for 20 minutes, scanning the parking area and the highway beyond, but saw no trace of the vehicle that had been following him. Shrugging it off as coincidence, Mike got back on the road. Within 10 minutes, the headlights reappeared in his mirrors, maintaining that same precise distance. This time, Mike was determined to get a better look at his mysterious follower. He adjusted his mirrors and tried to make out details of the vehicle, but the headlights were positioned in such a way that they created a blinding glare, making it impossible to see the make, model, or even the basic shape of the car behind them. The psychological pressure began to mount as Mike continued east through New Mexico. Every time he checked his mirrors, the lights were there, unwavering in their pursuit. He tried everything he could think of to shake his tail. Sudden lane changes, varying his speed dramatically, taking unexpected exits only to loop back onto the highway. Nothing worked. The vehicle seemed to anticipate his every move. By the time Mike reached Albuquerque, he was genuinely frightened. He pulled into a large truck stop, parked under the brightest lights he could find, and called his dispatcher. "Jim, I think someone's following me," he said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "They've been behind me for over 200 miles, matching every move I make." His dispatcher, Jim Rodriguez, had heard stranger things from drivers over the years. "You sure it's not just coincidence? Maybe you're both headed to the same destination." "Jim, I've tested this thing every way I can think of. This isn't normal driving behavior. Someone is deliberately following me, and I can't see who it is or what kind of vehicle they're driving." Jim advised Mike to contact local law enforcement if he felt truly threatened, but also suggested that Mike might be experiencing highway hypnosis or fatigue-induced paranoia. "Get some rest, Mike. If they're still there when you wake up, then we'll know something's really wrong." Mike tried to sleep, but every time he dozed off, he found himself checking his mirrors for those headlights. After a fitful 3-hour nap, he hit the road again, hoping his mysterious follower had given up and moved on. He wasn't so lucky. Within 15 minutes of leaving Albuquerque, the headlights reappeared. This time, however, something had changed. The vehicle was closer, maybe 2 car lengths back instead of 3. Mike could feel his heart rate increasing as the realization hit him that whoever was behind him was becoming more aggressive. As Mike drove through the night across the Texas Panhandle, the situation escalated further. The following vehicle would occasionally flash its high beams in seemingly random patterns. Sometimes it would drop back to the original 3-car distance. Other times it would close to within a single car length, close enough that Mike could feel the psychological pressure of being tailgated by an invisible pursuer. The most unnerving incident occurred near Amarillo around 4 a.m. Mike was driving through a particularly isolated section of highway when the following vehicle suddenly accelerated and pulled alongside his truck. Mike looked down from his cab, expecting finally to see his pursuer's face. But the windows of the car were completely tinted, darker than anything he had ever seen. He couldn't make out even the silhouette of a driver. The vehicle paced his truck for nearly 5 miles, staying perfectly aligned with Mike's cab. Then, without warning, it dropped back to its familiar following position. Mike realized his hands were shaking on the steering wheel. By dawn, Mike had been awake for over 24 hours, sustained only by adrenaline and truck stop coffee. The following vehicle showed no signs of fatigue or the need for fuel stops. It maintained its relentless pursuit as Mike crossed into Oklahoma, then Missouri. The psychological toll was becoming unbearable. In Missouri, Mike made a desperate decision. He pulled off at a rest area and called the state police, explaining his situation to a skeptical desk sergeant. "Sir, has this vehicle actually threatened you or attempted to harm you in any way?" the officer asked. "No, but they've been following me for over 800 miles. This isn't normal behavior. Unless they've committed a crime or made explicit threats, there's not much we can do. Following someone on a public highway isn't illegal, even if it's strange." Frustrated and exhausted, Mike realized he was on his own. He decided to make one final attempt to lose his pursuer by taking a complex series of exits and back roads around St. Louis. For 2 hours, he navigated city streets, industrial areas, and residential neighborhoods, taking random turns and doubling back on his route. For a brief, hopeful moment, thought he had succeeded. He saw no sign of the headlights as he merged back onto the interstate, but his relief was short-lived. 20 miles down the road, they were back, maintaining that same haunting distance. The final leg of Mike's journey into Chicago was a blur of fear and exhaustion. He had been followed for over 200 miles by an unknown person with unknown motives. As he approached his delivery destination, Mike wondered if his ordeal would finally end or if his pursuer would follow him to the loading dock. At the warehouse in Chicago, Mike backed up to the loading bay and sat in his cab, watching his mirrors. The mysterious vehicle drove slowly past the facility, its tinted windows revealing nothing, then disappeared around a corner. Mike waited for an hour, but it didn't return. The delivery was completed without incident, and Mike checked into a nearby motel for some much-needed rest. But sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside his room, every car door slamming in the parking lot, made him jump. He kept the curtains drawn and avoided looking out the windows. The next morning, Mike began his return journey to Phoenix. He had hoped the nightmare was over, but 15 miles outside of Chicago, the headlights reappeared in his mirrors. The same distance, the same relentless pursuit. Whoever was following him wasn't finished. The return trip was even more psychologically devastating than the first leg. Mike now knew that his pursuer was capable of following him across the entire country without apparent fatigue or need for extended stops. The implications were terrifying. Who had that kind of resources and dedication? What did they want? Mike tried everything he could think of during the return journey. He contacted truck stops ahead of time, asking security guards to watch for his pursuer. He varied his route, taking different highways and alternate roads. He even considered abandoning his truck and flying home, but his company needed the trailer delivered. Nothing worked. The vehicle stayed with him through Illinois, Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. It followed him through construction zones, around accidents, and past police checkpoints. It seemed immune to the normal constraints that affected other drivers. The most disturbing realization came to Mike somewhere in New Mexico during the return trip. He began to notice that other drivers on the highway seemed completely unaware of his pursuer. Cars would merge into the space between Mike's truck and the following vehicle, as if it wasn't there. Highway patrol officers would pass both vehicles without seeming to notice anything unusual about the convoy. Mike began to question his own sanity. Was he hallucinating? Was the stress of long-haul trucking finally causing him to break down mentally? But the headlights were always there in his mirrors, undeniably real and consistently positioned. When Mike finally reached Phoenix after his 2,400-mile round trip, he was a changed man. He had lost 15 pounds and developed a nervous tic that made his left eye twitch uncontrollably. His wife barely recognized the hollow-eyed, paranoid stranger who walked through their door. The following vehicle did not pursue Mike to his home. It disappeared somewhere on the outskirts of Phoenix, vanishing as mysteriously as it had first appeared. But Mike knew it was still out there, waiting for his next long-haul assignment. Mike never found out who was following him or why. He reported the incident to his company, the Department of Transportation, and multiple law enforcement agencies, but no investigation was ever launched. There was no evidence of a crime, no license plate number, no physical description of the pursuer. Within 3 months, Mike left long-haul trucking forever. He took a local delivery job that kept him within 50 miles of home, and he never drove at night again. Even now, years later, he won't discuss the details of those 4 days in March 2019 when something decided to follow him across America. The highways are full of mysteries that will never be explained, and some trucker somewhere is probably being followed by the same relentless headlights that haunted Mike Henderson. The thing that followed him home may still be out there, waiting for its next victim on the dark, empty roads that connect our cities. Mike's story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most frightening experiences are those that can't be explained, can't be proven, and can't be escaped. In the vast network of American highways, where millions of people travel every day, some encounters defy rational explanation and leave their victims forever changed. The headlights are still out there, maintaining their perfect distance, waiting for the next unsuspecting driver to begin their relentless, inexplicable pursuit. Danny Martinez thought he had heard everything during his 12 years of over-the-road trucking. CB radio chatter was part of the job, drivers warning each other about speed traps, weather conditions, and road hazards. But in September 2018, while hauling a load of construction equipment from Houston to Denver, Danny encountered something on Channel 19 that still haunts him today. It started on a Tuesday night around 11 p.m., somewhere between Lubbock and Amarillo on Interstate 27. Danny was listening to the usual CB traffic when a voice broke through that was different from anything he had heard before. It was calm, measured, and spoke with an unsettling precision that immediately caught his attention. "Eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 47. You're driving too fast for conditions." Danny looked at his speedometer. He was doing exactly 65 in a 70 zone, perfectly legal and safe for the clear, dry conditions. He glanced at his GPS. He was approaching mile marker 47. The voice had been talking about him. Danny keyed his mic. This is that eastbound Pete." "Who's this?" "I'm running legal speed here." Silence. No response. Danny figured it was just another driver being overly cautious and forgot about it. 20 minutes later, the voice returned. "Eastbound Peterbilt, you need to check your right rear trailer tire. You're going to have a blowout in approximately 37 miles. This time, Danny felt a chill run down his spine. The voice knew exactly what truck he was driving and where he was located. Even more disturbing, it spoke with a certainty that suggested the speaker somehow knew Danny's future. Danny pulled over at the next truck stop and walked around his trailer, inspecting each tire with his flashlight. Everything looked perfect. Good tread, proper inflation, no visible damage or wear. He was driving a nearly new Peterbilt with less than 50,000 miles on it, and the trailer had been inspected just 2 weeks earlier. Getting back on the road, Danny tried to dismiss the incident, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He turned his CB to scan mode, listening for any traffic that might reveal the identity of the mysterious voice, but heard only normal driver chatter about fuel prices and delivery schedules. Exactly 37 miles later, Danny's right rear trailer tire exploded. The blowout happened at 75 degrees on a straight stretch of highway with no traffic around. Danny managed to bring the rig safely to the shoulder, but his hands were shaking as he reached for his CB mic. "Break 19, this is eastbound Peterbilt at mile marker 84. I just had that tire failure you warned me about. Who is this? How did you know?" The response came immediately, as if the unknown speaker had been waiting for Danny's call. "You're going to need more than a tire change, driver. Check your trailer brake lines while you're down there." Danny's blood ran cold. He hadn't mentioned anything about changing the tire or getting out to inspect the trailer. The voice seemed to know his exact situation and what he would do next. With growing dread, Danny grabbed his flashlight and crawled under the trailer to examine the brake lines. What he found made his stomach drop. One of the air lines had been slowly leaking, probably for days, and was now hanging by a thread. If it had failed completely while he was driving, he would have lost braking power to the entire trailer, a potentially fatal situation on the mountainous roads ahead. "Jesus Christ," Danny whispered to himself, "this could have killed me." He called for roadside assistance and spent the next 4 hours waiting for a mobile repair crew. During that time, he tried repeatedly to contact the mysterious voice on Channel 19, but received no response. Other drivers checked in on him, offering help and company, but none of them had heard the warnings that had potentially saved his life. The repair technician who finally arrived was puzzled by the brake line damage. "This is weird," he said, examining the connection. "This looks like it was deliberately weakened, but that doesn't make sense. Who would have access to your trailer to do something like this?" Danny couldn't answer that question. His truck had been parked in secure company lots or truck stops with security cameras. The idea that someone had sabotaged his equipment seemed impossible, but the evidence was right there in front of them. After the repairs were completed, Danny continued toward Denver, but his nerves were on edge. He kept his CB on Channel 19, waiting for the voice to return. Around 3 a.m., as he was climbing through the mountains of New Mexico, it did. "Eastbound Peterbilt, reduce your speed immediately. There's black ice ahead at mile marker 23. Danny looked at his GPS. Mile marker 23 was still 8 miles away, and the road conditions appeared perfect. The temperature was well above freezing, and there had been no precipitation for days. But after the tire and brake line incidents, Danny wasn't taking any chances. He reduced his speed from 65 to 45 and turned on his hazard lights. At mile marker 23, Danny encountered a patch of black ice that stretched across both lanes of the highway. At his reduced speed, he was able to navigate it safely, but he saw the skid marks of less fortunate drivers who had hit the ice at full speed and slid off the road. "Thank you," Danny said into his CB mic. "You just saved my life again. Please tell me who you are." The response came with that same unsettling calm. "I'm someone who's been watching you, Danny Martinez. I know things about you that you don't even know about yourself." Danny's blood turned to ice. The voice had used his full name, information that wasn't available on his CB radio or anywhere else a casual observer could access. No one on the road should have known his identity. "How do you know my name? Are you following me? I know you live at 847 Cypress Street in Houston. I know you've been married to Maria for 8 years. I know your daughter Sophia is in the 3rd grade at Roosevelt Elementary. I know you're carrying 1847 in cash in your wallet. And I know you have a .38 revolver in your sleeper berth that isn't registered." Danny's heart was pounding so hard he could barely breathe. Every detail was correct, including information about the unregistered pistol that he had never told anyone about. Whoever was speaking to him had access to deeply personal information and had been conducting surveillance on his life. "What do you want from me?" Danny managed to ask. "I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. When you reach Denver tomorrow, you're going to be offered a job that seems too good to be true. A man named Carlos Mendoza will approach you at the Flying J truck stop on I-76. He'll offer you $50,000 to haul a load to Los Angeles with no questions asked. You're going to be tempted because you need the money for Sophia's medical bills." Danny felt like he was going to be sick. His daughter Sophia had been diagnosed with a rare kidney condition 6 months earlier, and the medical expenses were bankrupting his family. They had told no one about the financial strain, except their immediate family. How could this stranger know about Sophia's condition? "Don't take that job, Danny. The load will be drugs, and you'll be arrested at a checkpoint in Arizona. You'll spend the next 15 years in federal prison, and Sophia will never get the treatment she needs." The voice went silent, leaving Danny alone with his thoughts and fears. He tried calling back repeatedly, but Channel 19 remained quiet, except for normal trucker chatter. Danny spent the rest of the drive to Denver in a state of paranoid terror, constantly checking his mirrors and wondering who was watching him. When Danny reached the Flying J truck stop in Denver the next afternoon, he was exhausted and paranoid. He had barely slept and had been jumping at every sound. As he was fueling his truck, a well-dressed Hispanic man approached him with a friendly smile. "Are you Danny Martinez? I'm Carlos Mendoza. I heard you might be interested in making some extra money." Danny's blood ran cold. The mysterious voice had predicted this encounter exactly. Carlos was offering exactly what the voice had warned about: a high-paying job with no questions asked, hauling a load to Los Angeles. "I know this might seem unusual," Carlos continued, "but I have a time-sensitive shipment that needs to get to LA as quickly as possible. I'm willing to pay $50,000 cash for the right driver." Danny looked at Carlos's friendly face and thought about Sophia's medical bills. The money would solve all their problems, but the voice on Channel 19 had warned him about this exact moment, and everything else the voice had predicted had come true. "Thanks, but I'm not interested," Danny said, turning away. Carlos became more insistent. "Think about it, man. This is easy money. All you have to do is drive to Los Angeles. No paperwork, no complications." I said no. Danny watched Carlos walk away, wondering if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life or if he had avoided a federal prison sentence. He called his dispatcher and requested a load back to Houston, eager to get home to his family. On the return trip, Danny tried repeatedly to contact the mysterious voice, but Channel 19 remained silent. He wanted answers. Who had been watching him, how they knew so much about his personal life, and why they had chosen to help him instead of harm him. He never got those answers. The voice never returned to Channel 19, and Danny never learned the identity of his mysterious benefactor. But 2 weeks after returning home, Danny read a news article that chilled him to the bone. Carlos Mendoza had been arrested in Arizona, along with another truck driver who had accepted the job Danny had turned down. The truck was carrying 500 pounds of cocaine, and the driver was facing a federal sentence of 15 years to life. Danny quit long-haul trucking within a month. He took a local job driving a delivery truck in Houston, staying close to home and his family. He never used a CB radio again and avoided interstate highways whenever possible. The voice on Channel 19 had saved Danny's life multiple times in a single night, then disappeared as mysteriously as it had arrived. Danny never figured out if his guardian angel was a person with access to incredible surveillance technology, a government agent, or something else entirely. What he did know was that someone had been watching him with an almost supernatural knowledge of his future, and that someone had chosen to save him from a fate that would have destroyed his family. In the world of long-haul trucking, where drivers often feel isolated and forgotten, Danny had encountered something that proved he wasn't as alone as he thought. The CB radio waves still carry voices across the highways of America, and somewhere out there, another driver might be getting warnings about dangers they can't yet see. The voice on Channel 19 might still be watching, still protecting drivers from fates they don't know they're approaching. Danny Martinez never forgot that night, and he never stopped wondering who had cared enough to save him from himself. Sometimes the most terrifying encounters are the ones that save your life, leaving you forever grateful to a stranger whose identity you'll never know.